So today's topic is altruism or utilitarianism. So today I will talk about Bentham's view of altruistic hedonism. Now, according to altruistic hedonism, universal or general happiness is the ultimate moral standard, because it is not a practical proposition to promote the happiness of all persons. We ought to aim at the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Actions are right or wrong according as they are conducive to or subversive of happiness in general. There are many who characterize this doctrine of utilitarianism because according to it, actions are to be judged according to their utility or usefulness as means for promotion of greatest happiness of the greatest number. The utilitarianists or altruists admit of the existence of the capacity of sympathy or fellow feeling which impels man to promote the good of others and prevents him from doing injustice to them. Bentham and Mill are the two chief exponents of this view, but they differ in that Bentham recognizes only quantitative distinction of pleasures, while Mill recognizes the qualitative distinction as well. Like Aristippus, Bentham also recognizes no qualitative distinction among pleasures. All pleasures, physical and mental, are alike. The value of a pleasure, according to Bentham, consists entirely in the quantity of agreeable experiences it produces. Pushpin is as good as poetry. This we can take example of this line for this if they are equal in the quantity of pleasure they produce. Bentham holds that the only standard of valuation of pleasure is quantitative. But quantity takes different forms. Quantity has 7 dimensions of value. For example, intensity. One pleasure is more intense than the other. Of pleasures otherwise equal, the more intense pleasure is preferable to a less intense one. Secondly, duration. One pleasure is more durable than the other. Of pleasure otherwise equal, the more durable pleasure should be preferred to the less durable. Thirdly, proximity. An immediate pleasure is preferable to a remote one. Present should not be sacrificed to the future. Fourthly, certainty. A certain pleasure is preferable to an uncertain pleasure. Fifthly, purity. A pleasure is pure when it is free from pain. A pleasure is impure when it is mixed with pain. A pure pleasure is to be preferred to an impure one. Sixthly, fecundity. A pleasure has fecundity when it gives rise to a number of other pleasures. A pleasure which brings with it other pleasures is preferable to a barren pleasure which does not yield any other pleasures. Seventhly, extent. A pleasure may be enjoyed by a large number of persons or by a small number of persons. A pleasure of greater extent, that is, a pleasure which is enjoyable by a large number of persons, is preferable to one of less extent. Therefore, the different forms of quantity are intensity, duration, proximity, certainty, purity, fecundity, and extent. Bentham is an advocate of psychological hedonism. Though Bentham is an altruist and says that we should seek the happiness of others, yet he distinctly says that we naturally seek our own happiness. To obtain the greatest portion of happiness for himself is the object of every rational being. It should be pointed out that Bentham is of the opinion that the word happiness is not always appropriate because it represents pleasure in an elevated form. If we take away pleasure and pain, happiness will be reduced to an empty sound. Bentham believes in hedonistic calculus. According to him, we should weigh pleasure and should also weigh pains. And the question of right and wrong, if it gives pleasure in excess over pain. In calculating pleasures and pains, we take into account the 7 dimensions of quantity of pleasure. Bentham's utilitarianism may be called gross or sensualistic because it does not recognize any qualitative differences among pleasures. Though Bentham has mentioned purity as a dimension of pleasure, yet it has not elevated his doctrine. By purity he has meant no superior quality, but merely freedom from pain. Yet, Bentham's view is known as altruism or utilitarianism because he has taken into account the external of pleasures, that is, the number of persons affected by them. Bentham, by introducing extent as a dimension of pleasure, introduces altruism into his doctrine. Greatest happiness of the greatest number is the moral standard. If man is naturally egoistic, as Bentham maintains, why he should seek the happiness of others? Bentham explains this transition from egoism to altruism by means of 4 external sanctions: physical or natural, social, political, and religious. The physical or natural sanctions, for example, the laws of health, LAWS, L-A-W-S, the laws of health, if disobeyed, will lead to painful consequences. Disobedience to social sanctions will lead to excommunication of the man concerned. Political sanctions, if disobeyed, will bring punishment, and religious sanctions are enforced under the fear of punishment in hell. These 4 external sanctions are external pressures upon the individual so as to compel him to sacrifice his own interests to those of society. According to Bentham, the individual passes from egoism to altruism under the pressure of the external sanctions. Now, Bentham's theory is open to the following criticisms, or we can say objections. Firstly, Bentham, though an altruist, believes in psychological hedonism. But psychological hedonism is defective. It is not true that we desire pleasure. We, on the contrary, seek the desired object which, when attained, gives pleasure. But we do not directly desire pleasure. Moreover, the more we hanker after pleasure, the less we get it. Besides this, if it is a fact that every man seeks his own pleasure, then there is no meaning in maintaining that everyone should seek his own pleasure. Secondly, the hedonistic calculus mentioned by Bentham is impracticable. Pleasure and pain cannot be weighed on the two sides of a balance like material things. The feelings of pleasure and pain are subjective and therefore variable. Therefore, nothing can be added to or subtracted from them. Thirdly, Bentham's altruism is, after all, gross or sensualistic. He has, however, mentioned purity as one of the dimensions of the quantity of pleasure, but introduction of this dimension has not been able to elevate his doctrine. By purity, he has not meant any superior quality. Rather, it only means freedom from pain. There is no qualitative difference among pleasures, but this cannot be accepted. Artistic enjoyment and pleasure of eating sweetmeats are different in kind. Thirdly, Bentham also failed to satisfactorily explain the transition from egoism to altruism. He has, however, mentioned extensity of pleasure. In fact, the pleasure which have the dimension of extensity, that is the pleasure that can be enjoyed by a greater number of persons, are intellectual and aesthetic. Sensuous pleasures cannot be shared by many persons. It is evident, therefore, that extensity of pleasure has a reference to its quality. But Bentham does not seem to recognize any qualitative difference among pleasures. And finally, Bentham has mentioned 4 names of external sanctions to explain the social feelings in man who are by nature egoistic. These laws are obeyed not for their own sake, but for the aggrandizement of our own interests. These external sanctions can create a physical compulsion, but never moral obligation. In choosing to obey the external sanctions, we evince prudence, but prudence is not a virtue.